Late last month, the Missouri grand jury declined to indict Darren Wilson, a white police officer, for the shooting death of Michael Brown, an unarmed black teen. And today, here in Brooklyn, another family is grieving a similar death. 28-year-old Akai Gurley was fatally shot by rookie police officer Peter Liang during a patrol of an East New York housing project. And like Michael Brown, Akai Gurley was unarmed. But in a marked distinction to police comments made in Ferguson immediately after the shooting of Michael Brown, Akai Gurley was characterized as totally innocent by New York Police Commissioner Bill Bratton. Now, as Brooklyn District Attorney Ken Thompson prepares to announce whether he'll seek an indictment against that officer, Officer Liang, we ask what lessons can be, or rather should be, learned from the recent events in Missouri. We'll also ask whether the Brooklyn criminal justice system has what it takes to become a role model for policing and prosecutorial reform nationwide. Joining the BK Live discussion on this matter are two guests who have both spoken out about the criminal justice system, excessive police force, and reform options. We have Alex Vitale, who is a sociology professor at Brooklyn College. Thank you so much for being here. And returning to BK Live is Andrew Stoll, now a BK Live veteran, who is a civil rights attorney with Stoll, Glickman, and Bellina. Of course, welcome back. And on the phone with us, we are very lucky to have from Washington, D.C., U.S. Congressman Hakeem Jeffries from Brooklyn. I thank you all for joining us. Congressman Jeffries, how are you?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I want to start with you, Congressman. It seems as though every time we turn a headline these days, the headline reads the same. Another person of color being shot or killed by a police officer, and the stats really do seem to back this up. The 2012 NYPD firearm discharge report, and that's the latest statistic we have to date, notes that 69% of the individuals killed by a New York City police bullet were African Americans. I mean, is this an epidemic that we're seeing here, Congressman?
Absolutely an epidemic of police violence and excessive use of force. And that's why we're seeing a movement all across the country rising up to combat it, because the use of excessive force by the police, sometimes resulting in tragic loss of life, such as recently in the context of Akai Gurley, is not just a Brooklyn problem or a Staten Island problem or a Ferguson problem or an Oakland problem or a Cleveland problem. It's an American problem. Now, I think it requires several things. One, we've got to make sure that the victims receive justice in the context of a fair and impartial investigation that, in appropriate circumstances, should lead to a grand jury indictment and a prosecution. Certainly, I've got faith and confidence in the Brooklyn District Attorney to do the right thing based on the law and the facts as it relates to Akai Gurley. But we also need a change in police policy in terms of how communities of color are dealt with from a law enforcement perspective, because the system right now is broken. And we need a balance between effective policing on the one hand, but a healthy respect for the Constitution and civil rights, particularly of residents of color, on the other. And the system is out of balance right now.
And what's your reaction, as we're talking about some reform options and tactics, on President Obama's announcement just yesterday to increase, hopefully, federal funding for pilot programs such as the one that would likely be instituted in East New York for body cameras on police officers?
Well, I think that was an important step in the right direction and an example of an area where we can actually find common ground. There are more difficult topics that we're going to have to work our way through.
Such as what? Such as what, Congressman?
Well, such as sort of dealing with racial profiling by law enforcement. And how do we prevent that from happening? I was very pleased to see the Attorney General address that issue yesterday. Congress needs to tackle that issue, and we need to figure out how we can deal with it. But the body cameras is an effective step in the right direction, both because it will exonerate officers who are wrongly accused, but it will also provide a clear picture of what took place when a police encounter has gone wrong, so that we don't have to deal with the type of confusion that was created by the prosecutor down in Ferguson, Missouri.
Now, in Brooklyn, as District Attorney Ken Thompson does prepare to make his own announcement in the Gurley shooting, you did mention not only today but also in earlier press conferences that you have confidence in DA Thompson. What exactly does that mean? What kind of confidence do you have, and what, in your opinion, would be justice in the Gurley case?
Well, 2 or 3 days following the tragic loss of Mr. Gurley's life, Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, myself, as well as Public Advocate Tish James actually met for about an hour with District Attorney Thompson and his senior team to discuss the case, the process moving forward. I was pleased that immediately upon being notified of the shooting that took place, the District Attorney assigned the matter to the Civil Rights Division, dispatched the head of the Civil Rights Unit to the scene, who had an opportunity to interview the witness, non-police witness, immediately, and to commence its investigation at that point, independent of what the police department was doing. That was an important step. At this juncture, what I'd like to see is a presentation of the case at the appropriate time to a grand jury, because the district attorney and the grand jury ultimately are going to have to determine, was this a non-criminal accident, as the police commissioner has indicated, and I've been grappling with that characterization for the last 10 days because I don't believe it's a fair characterization, or was this criminally negligent homicide, was this manslaughter, was this reckless endangerment of human life? And so there's a process that's going to move forward, but unlike the previous district attorney who had a history of punting on these cases, unfortunately, particularly during his latter years, we've got a new district attorney who I believe is committed to justice.
Thank you so much, Congressman. And I know that you are currently in session right now on the Hill, so we really do appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with us. Any last words that you'd like to share with the BK Live audience?
Well, I appreciate the discussion on this very important topic. I think that we need to have a New York City-based discussion. Certainly, in my view, Brooklyn is the center of the universe, but we want to change police behavior and accountability. We want to strengthen the relationship moving forward. We've got a lot of work to do, and I look forward to participating in that effort.
Thank you again, Congressman.
Thank you.
Going back to something that the Congressman said, the characterization of this incident as an accident. And really quickly, Andrew, I want to turn to you because you had mentioned in an article in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle that you don't believe that this is an accident. You questioned that.
I question it, and I share the Congressman's sentiments about the new district attorney in Brooklyn, but Police Commissioner Bratton seems to have prejudged the situation and publicly prejudged the situation already. He came out and said, without even the benefit of an interview with the offending officer, he has concluded publicly that this was an accidental discharge. And I would say, calling on a firing of a gun with a 12-pound trigger weight an accidental discharge is like calling dropping a barbell out of a window an accidental discharge. It's ridiculous. It may be that the officer here did not intend to kill an innocent man. I would certainly hope and assume that's the case. But the idea that he accidentally discharged his gun, I think, is extremely suspect.
Intention aside, let's go along with the police line that this was an accidental, discharge. Does it matter as far as criminal culpability is concerned? An individual was killed, a gun was fired. Is anyone responsible if we go along the line that this was purely an accident?
Well, I think there's a question as to whether...
Criminally, not civilly responsible.
Criminally. I think if it is an accident and the intent was not there, every crime has a mens rea, a mental culpability element. And so, of course it matters. It absolutely matters. There's a broader policy question, of course, whether we should have an occupying force in our housing projects, on our streets, walking around with their fingers on the trigger, viewing the community that they're supposed to be serving as hostile territory. But that's a broader question.
And that goes to something that you had written. I mean, we're going on articles here, but it has been something you wrote in an op-ed piece for the New York Post that Daily News, thank you. One of the possible causes for these kinds of instances, what happened to Mr. Gurley, is an over-policing of minority neighborhoods. Is that the only cause? Are there more factors involved here?
Well, I think over-policing is like a broad way of thinking about this problem. And I think that it's great that we're having a national conversation about policing, but my concern is that that conversation is going to be limited to things like training and increasing diversity of police and body cameras, and not a more fundamental rethink of what the police role should be, especially in high crime communities and communities of color. I think part of the problem, and this is a real tragic dilemma, I think, for public housing residents, because they bear a high burden of crime. but they've been told the only option that's available to them is overly aggressive policing. And they then pay the consequences for that in lost lives, but also in the everyday harassment, the everyday discourtesy, and the hundreds of thousands of arrests that are made each year, mostly for very low-level, broken windows, we've heard that term a lot, kinds of infractions, some of which shouldn't even be a crime in my view. And we've come to think of the police as the only agency of city government that's there to try to deal with these crime and disorder problems, and that's where I think we need the rethink.
And what are some other factors or some other elements that can be considered when working to better community relations between the police and the members of the community that live there?
Well, I think, there are improvements could be made to police-community relations, and we should do some thinking about improving training, et cetera. But I think we also need to be thinking about alternatives to relying on the police to solve these problems. I think communities of color need to have a real public conversation about the war on drugs and whether or not it's really serving these communities. These communities experience the negative impact of drugs in very real ways, but they're also bearing the brunt of the mass criminalization of young men and women in these communities. And I think that's no longer a worthwhile equation. We need to rethink our whole approach to drugs and whether or not the police should be at the center of that. We need to rethink what's going on in public housing. How could residents be empowered to try to manage the very real problems that exist in these housing projects, including the lights don't work, the elevators don't work, but also what's going on in the stairwells, who's being victimized.
And that was an issue, unfortunately, in the Gurley shooting, that the lights in that stairwell where the police officer, Liang, and another were doing a vertical patrol was out. The stairwell was darkened. And I want to turn really quickly to a little bit more of the legal context of this case and some of the issues around here. So I'm going to turn to you, Andrew. Given the public facts of the case, darkened stairwell, 2 rookie police officers doing a vertical patrol in a housing project that has had some reports of criminal activity, gun is drawn, reason why we don't know, and a flashlight in hand. Those are the facts that we know. Those facts alone, is that sufficient for criminally negligent homicide? And if not, are there other criminal charges that can be assigned just to those facts that we have to this police officer?
In my opinion, there's enough to give to a grand jury. You know, we have a grand jury. It's made up of the citizens of this borough. Hand the evidence to them and let them decide. That's their job. It's not my job to decide, and I'm not a prosecutor. But frankly, it's not even D.A. Thompson's job to decide whether they should be indicted, and he knows that. The role of the grand jury is to screen the evidence and investigate and decide. And so the whole gamut is available. I mean, like I said, it does not sound like an accidental discharge. It was probably an intentional discharge with accidental results. But there's one body that's designed to sort that out, and that's the grand jury.
Now, federal statistics show that police officers involved in police shootings very rarely get indicted by a grand jury. I know that we want to send this to the grand jury. I know that's what Andrew mentioned, and I think, Professor Vitale, that this is something that you are also supporting. Given the statistics at hand, can we expect a grand jury in Brooklyn to indict this police officer, given the facts that we know and given the history of grand juries as a whole for police-involved shooting? Professor?
Well, I wouldn't count on it. I mean, I think that the DA should give the evidence a first pass before deciding on the grand jury, and a grand jury is certainly a reasonable way to go. But the way the criminal law is written gives police a great deal of latitude in the use of force, and the reality is that grand juries tend to be extremely sympathetic to the police side of the story. And so I think it's a mistake, both in Ferguson and on Staten Island and here in Brooklyn, to focus on criminal prosecution as the solution to these problems. I mean, we need accountability for officer misconduct, and criminal prosecution is one part of that, but I don't think we can count on that as the real solution. I think, as the Congressman mentioned before, the social movement activity happening in the streets may turn out to be much more significant in trying to really change the rules of the game and create some real accountability.
And Andrew, what do you think with regard to the statistics of police officers being indicted and what a possible grand jury may face in Brooklyn? What do you think the outcome would be?
Historically, respectfully, I don't think the problem in getting grand jury indictments against officers is the standard and the legal instructions. I think the problem is that the grand jury is often a tool of a district attorney, and a district attorney can pretty much direct the outcome of any grand jury proceeding. They shouldn't. What they should do is just give the evidence to the grand jury and let them decide. But everybody knows the old saying, the grand jury will indict a ham sandwich if the DA wants them to.
With the exception being police officers involved in shootings, though.
Because the grand jury is usually led by a sympathetic political representative who is more concerned about his reputation in the community than getting an indictment against a police officer. Look, I want to be clear. I'm not calling for an indictment of this police officer. What I am calling for is a fair, even-handed presentation of the evidence. And we should be clear what an indictment is. An indictment is not a conviction. An indictment is just a formal accusation. It just requires probable cause or reasonable cause to believe that the person committed the crime. It's a jury at the end of the process that decides whether the case has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So there's plenty of screening mechanism to be had.
And what I've been calling for a few years now is actually the creation of a blue desk in the State Attorney General's office.
What would that be?
Well, I have a lot of confidence in the Brooklyn DA too, supported him, but there are fundamental conflicts of interest involved here because local DAs need the everyday cooperation of local police in order to get convictions, which is the coin of the realm for them. What we need is to set up an office in the State Attorney General's office that is responsible for all police prosecutions statewide, to remove that fundamental conflict of interest. They could still potentially work with local grand juries, but the decisions about what evidence to provide, whether or not to take things to a grand jury, I think needs to be removed from those political dynamics. And I think this is especially true on Staten Island, where you have a DA that everyone knows got elected with the very strong backing of the local police, the police unions, and there's just an appearance of a conflict of interest that I think is going to cloud whatever decision comes out in that case.
Well, I think we will continue to follow this. I mean, this is an issue that's not just New York, not just Brooklyn. It's definitely nationwide, so I'm sure we'll have you both back here to discuss this a little bit more in further detail. Thank you again for being here.
Welcome.
And of course, thank you to the Congressman for taking the time.